Good evening. Thank you for coming this evening for the Feld Memorial Lecture. The lecture is named for Natalie Feld. Ms. Feld was a high school teacher as well as a businesswoman and investor who loved history and culture. We are very grateful for the support of the Feld family. The Kla Library is delighted to have Professor Stephen Fine here with us tonight. Dr. Fine, historian of Judaism in the Greco-Roman world, is the Pinchas Churgin Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University in New York and director of the Arch of Titus Digital Restoration Project of the Yeshiva University Center for Israel Studies. Professor Fine is a cultural historian. His research focuses on the relationships between the literature of ancient Judaism, art, and archaeology. Fine's blend of history, rabbinic literature, archaeology, and art together with deep engagement with historiography and contemporary culture is expressed in a broad range of publications. In recent years, Dr. Fine has been researching the Samaritans. He is the director of the Yeshiva University Israelite Samaritan project, where he curated the first exhibition dedicated to the Samaritan, which can now be seen at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. Dr. Fine recently published a book, and you can see it in the back, titled The Samaritans, a Biblical People, and also was the co-producer of the documentary that we just saw, The Samaritan, a Biblical People. Dr. Fine is a familiar face in the library. He used to teach at the University of Cincinnati and was a regular visitor in the library. We are very happy to have him back here. And so I want to mention something else. Here we have a Samaritan scroll. One of the, and I encourage you to come and take a look and be careful. This is the oldest Samaritan scroll that is it's the oldest Samaritan scroll, and we dated to 1140, as I remember. So, and it's a treasure, one of the treasure of our library. I would like to thank Abigail Becken and the library staff for all of their hard work putting this evening together. I would also like to thank the JCC, the Dean's Office, and the AJA for supporting this event. And please welcome Dr. Fine.
Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be back in Cincinnati and this beautiful library where I spent so much of my time. I'm very fortunate. I spent a great deal of time as a master's degree student at the Hebrew Union College Library next to USC in Los Angeles. A great deal of time at the Jerusalem branch where I wrote most of my dissertation at the Hebrew University. And then working in Cincinnati, I came into this warm environment where, on top of being the source of most of my books, my baby went to daycare right over here at the Hebrew Union College. And so my warmth is endless. Now, you know, I teach at Yeshiva University, which is another one of those Jewish religionist institutions that cares about Judaism deeply. And so we're a sister institution. In fact, there was a wonderful letter that I'll show tomorrow that was published in 1928, a letter that was to support the Jewish Palestine Exploration Society. And it was signed by Stephen S. Wise, the Jewish Institute of Religion, and Professor Morgenstern of Hebrew Union College, and Cyrus Adler at JTS, and Bernard Revel at Yeshiva University, all on the same piece of paper. And I've never seen, Gary can tell me, if there's another piece of paper that has the four of them in one place, but I hope there are lots of them that I just haven't seen. Now, we're talking about Samaritans. What we're going to do for a little while is talk about stuff that I brought to share with you. And then I'm going to stop and we'll talk both about that and about any questions people have having watched my movie. Now, the YU Israelite Samaritan Project is a multifaceted and fascinating project. It includes the video that you just saw that Moshe Alafi created for us, with us. It involves an exhibition that you can come and see at the Museum of the Bible through Passover. It includes another version of it that's at the Bibelhaus in Frankfurt if you happen to be going to Germany. It includes the book that you can see in the back, which I think it's fair to say it's the first book ever to include greetings from the president of the Yeshiva University and side by side greetings from the high priest of the Samaritans in Samaritan. I think that's fair to say, and published jointly with Yeshiva University Press. In other words, this is taking all of that interest in Samaritans, and I forgot one more piece, and that's our cookbook. Taking all of this interest in Samaritans and using all different kinds of media to raise the profile of people who really until World War II didn't need to have their profile raised, because scholars were fascinated by Samaritans all through the 19th century up until just before World War II, when the war came in. And then right after, these scraps came out of the Judean desert and everyone got excited about them. But until the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Samaritans were the place to go if you wanted something interesting and cool and outside the system, and you wanted to study it, and you wanted to be biblical and midrashic and all of that. And so there was a large wealth of scholarship through the 30s that picked up again in the 70s and 80s. But it all got published in these blue books by Morris Ziebeck that no one could afford and no one could read. And there was no way of accessing it. And so something very strange happened. And this goes back to HUC being a Jewish institution as well as YU. In the big world, if you work at the University of Cincinnati, let me tell you a secret. Samaritans are not on the top of everyone's interest. And neither is Judaism. And they may think they're a secular university, but in fact, it's a Christian culture. And the questions of the majority are the questions that are asked. And so Samaritans become one of those places where two different groups of Israelites who are in fact related can have a conversation and without Christians. Christians aren't a necessary part of a conversation where in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries in the land of Israel, Jews and Samaritans together were the majority. And in the city of Caesarea by the sea that we'll see in a moment, they were a clear majority, the Samaritans more than the Jews, as we'll see. Now, all of this is to begin. So let me make sure my slides work. First of all, can we take down these lights a little bit? Is that possible?
I can try.
Oh, good, because it's too bright. This is our exhibition, Come to Washington. It's utterly cool. You can walk right into the Passover sacrifice and feel what it feels like, but we kept the blood down. Come to our book, our exhibition, that's much better, in Frankfurt. This multimedia project is so that everyone will say, oh, they're interesting, and they can never be off the table again in having conversations about that threesome, which is now two groups of Israelites of the flesh and a group that considers itself Israel of the spirit in conversation. Now, we all know who Samaritans are. They have hospitals, right? That's the one next door, believe it or not. They have laws so that if you save somebody in good faith, you don't get hurt. And then there's all those artists like, Rembrandt. We all know who Samaritans are, but no one knows who Samaritans are. It's an astonishing thing. And people are used to thinking about, this guy, the Good Samaritan. You know why he's called the Good Samaritan? Because in the 1st century, there was only one Good Samaritan, because Jews and Samaritans were in conflict in the 1st century, much of the time. And positive conversations, after all, John Hyrcanus II destroyed the Samaritan temple in 110 BCE. That's not a good reason to be friends, right? When your holy place has been destroyed by those Hasmoneans. Now, the Good Samaritan, as you may know, is the one who saved some poor human being along a road between Jericho and Jerusalem when more official people didn't. And the reason that he's a Samaritan and not somebody else is he's the guy you least think is going to save any Jew. And that's what makes the story work. Then there's this story that some of us know exceedingly well in this room of the woman at the well. Now, there's only a few things that I want to share with you about the woman at the well, whom I can't see because she's there and I am here. Number one, the path between Judea and the Galilee went right through Nablus, went right through Shechem. And so we have lots of conversations between Jews and Samaritans up and down that road. Usually something like this, as one of the rabbis said it in the 3rd century. Oh, you're walking to Jerusalem. Why would you bother going that far when you can stay at this holy mountain? Or in this story, you guys don't usually talk to us. What are you doing here? And what do you think of our holy mountain, right? In other words, that meeting point that's unexpected along the way between the north and the south sets some of the agenda. Now, let's take a look at our map again, north to south. Does this thing have a pointer on it? I don't think so. North to south from the Galilee through Shechem, through Nablus to Jerusalem, or east to west from Jericho up to Jerusalem. Choose your New Testament story. It's one of those two, right? Just to get our geographical bearings. Now, Samaritans have been associated with Mount Gerizim since biblical times. The Samaritans, as you may not have known, but now know, are the people who claim and probably are the descendants of the unlost 10 tribes. In other words, members of Ephraim and Manasseh and Levi, who never left and had a large diaspora in the ancient world. And we know a lot about them, and we know even more. This stone, which was just in Washington and was for the first time it was ever out of Greece, from the island of Delos in the Aegean, says it very, very nicely. The Israelites on Delos who made offerings to the temple of Gerizim with a golden crown, honor Serapion, bum, bum, bum. Now there's the golden crown. It was probably yellow when the stone was first carved and displayed. But what's important is this place called Gerizim. Gerizim, like Armageddon, right? Armageddon is Mount Megiddo, Har Megiddo. This is Gerizim. And so in the 2nd century BC, the Samaritan Diaspora, it wasn't as big as the Jewish diaspora. They were never as numerous as Jews, but they were always out there. Now, this is the holy mountain, the mountain that God has chosen, according to the book of Deuteronomy in the Samaritan version, Hamakom Asher Bachar Hashem, not Hamakom Asher Yivchar Hashem, the place that God has chosen, the subject of the 10th commandment of the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is, you will sacrifice on Mount Gerizim. Okay? Now, other than that, their Pentateuch is the same as everybody else's Pentateuch in the Second Temple period. It's a standard Second Temple period sort of version of the Torah, except for the references to Mount Gerizim here and there. Now, that reference to Mount Gerizim, as you may know, is the place that Noah's Ark landed. It's the place where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac. It's the place where Joshua set up the tabernacle. Now, if you didn't know that, then you're probably not Samaritan. Because, of course, according to Jewish versions, there's all these things happen in other places, most of them through a process that a great scholar named Yitzchak Heinemann called concentration or rikuz, whether that you have your sources concentrated on Mount Zion or whether you have them concentrated on Mount Gerizim, you may look like one another. You may smell like one another. You may have food laws. You may have the Sabbath. You may have Passover, but Mount Gerizim is the deal breaker. Okay? God chose one mountain and it ain't yours, which created a 2,000-year death dance, maybe longer. Now, the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim was destroyed by John Hyrcanus II somewhere around 110 BCE, but don't worry, there's a holiday for it. You didn't know that, right? Yeah. It's a book called Megillat Ta'anit. It's days when you're not allowed to fast. And it says Let me read it to you. Vesrim v'chad be yom agrizim lo lemisped. On the 21st day of the month of Kislev is Mount Argrizim. Don't have a fast on that day. It's a day for celebration. I think it's fair to say that no one's actually celebrated Har Gerizim for a long time, though there was a year when I gave out candy to my students. It's true. On the 21st of Kislev, which is just before Hanukkah. And we did premiere the film in Jerusalem on the 21st of Kislev, but we didn't tell anybody. Can you imagine having a day when you celebrate the destruction of the temple on Mount Gerizim? You can hear the relationship with these people. It wasn't a good one, right? And it went throughout this period. Samaritans at one point brought profane bones and put them on the Temple Mount on Passover in Jerusalem, and so the Jews wouldn't be able to go in that part of the mountain. Jews did stuff to Samaritans. This was a wonderfully bad experience through much of antiquity. And so when I say there was only one good Samaritan, you know, the only good Samaritan is a dead Samaritan, right? There was only one good Samaritan. And that's why the story works so well. Now, what you're looking at is their temple, which was excavated by Yitzchak Magen through the 80s. Down below, it's amazing staircases going back to the 5th and 6th century BCE, numerous inscriptions. On top is a church plopped on top of the mountain by the Christians in the 5th century, right? And then rebuilt in the 6th and 7th, in the 6th, excuse me, by Justinian. So forget the octagonal thing on top. You just have to forget about that. The rest of it is a Samaritan holy place. But if you ask a Samaritan, they will tell you that there is no Samaritan temple. Samaritans have no memory of having had a temple. Josephus has a memory of Samaritans having had a temple. Okay? Now, what's this thing that Magen dug up if it's not a temple? Well, I asked, because I have very good relations with Samaritan people. And I said to Benny Tzedakah, who you may have seen in the film, so Benny, if there's no temple, what's that? He said, and he didn't really answer. I said, Benny, it looks to me like a mechtam korbanot, a platform for a area for sacrifices. He said, yes, it's a mechtam korbanot. I said, great. Now, let me tell all of you here that there is no difference between a mechtam korbanot and a temple, except the Samaritans do not remember having had a temple. Okay? So semantics are important in most relationships. Now, this relationships with the Samaritans was awful in the 1st century. In fact, the rabbis remember that in their attempt to send the messages off to Babylonia and to northern Israel, that Rosh Hashanah had arrived by putting torches on top of mountains, so sort of a relay, so that the information could get to Babylonia almost instantaneously. Those nefarious Samaritans, those Kutim, came in and ruined it. Now, let me just say as an aside, when my son was studying at the Cincinnati Hebrew Day School, he had a teacher who was teaching this thing about Rosh Hashanah time. And the teacher was a very, very nice man, was teaching about those nefarious Kusim. And Elisha raised his hand, Rabbi so-and-so, and you may know him, so I'm not going to say who it is. Rabbi so-and-so, you shouldn't call the Samaritans Kutim. At least they had the right good pronunciation, right? You shouldn't call the Samaritans Kutim. Why, Elisha, should we not call them Kutim? Because my Abba has friends who are Samaritans, and it's like the N-word, which in fact it is. It's calling Samaritans something other than authentic Israelites. And so this fight, this unpleasant relationship existed right through the year 70 when things started to change. Because after 70, Jews, the Judeans, and Samaritans, both of whom had been bashed by Vespasian and Titus, needed each other. Samaritans began to spread out of Samaria toward the coastal plain, down towards the south, and Jews were reconstructing themselves. And a new relationship began to exist for about 400 years. And that's where I want to go now. So, up above you see matzah baking. You saw that in the film as well. Now, what does it say here? Oh, let me read it to you. Hello, camera. The matzah of the Kutim. Yeah. Matzah shel kutim, muteret, v'adam yotzeh ba lidei chovato b'Pesach. You can eat the matzah of kutim. So forget folks Manischewitz, Straits, any of them. Go find your local Samaritan matzah and buy it for the holiday, which you will not find. Rabbi Eliezer, who's always rather strict on these kinds of relationship issues and always jumps back to the way things were before the temple was destroyed, didn't like this at all. Rabbi Eliezer prohibits it, for they are not expert in specific regulations regarding unleavened bread. Now, whenever you want to say in Judaism that you don't really want to listen to somebody but don't have an reason, you say he's not expert enough, he's not machmir enough, right? You say he doesn't understand, because you can't say that their matzah is treif. You can't say that their matzah is unacceptable. Next, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel around 150 says, any commandment which the Samaritans have taken hold of, they are much more meticulous about it than Israel is. Okay? Any of the commandments of the Torah that they have, they do well. They just don't have all the commandments because they don't have the rabbinic traditions. That's real different than what we saw before. We have a parallel community. Now remember, in English, we talk about Jews and Samaritans, but in Hebrew, we talk about Bnei Yisrael. And that's what the two communities call each other. And so when scholars went around and talked about, Judean, Samaritan Judaism, it's like an oxymoron, right? Because they're both the traditions of the people of Israel, the northern ones and the southern ones. This capital, which is from a place called Amayos, which is at Shar Hagai, for those people who know the way up to Jerusalem, is in a monastery in Bethlehem. It took quite a bit of effort to get there to see this stone. It was found in the 19th century. You would have thought it was from a Jewish synagogue, except for the Samaritan script, down to what's written on it, right? I mean, it's so parallel, right? And blessed is his name eternally. I mean, hello, right? Just choose your script. If it's in a Jewish script, it would be Jewish. And if it's a Samaritan script, it's Samaritan. But it's the same kind of language in a place that both call synagogues. These are two communities that are adjacent to each other in so many ways that it almost feels sometimes like you're in a fun house, right? That you're looking at the mirrors and it almost looks like you, but there's a slight distortion, whether you're Samaritan looking in the mirror, or whether you're Jewish looking in the mirror. But there's a distorted mirror image. My son, who's a Star Trek fan, keeps telling me it's like the mirror universe. And I keep pointing out to him for Star Trekkies that no, neither one is bad and neither one is good. They're just Samaritans and Jews. And that makes the Star Trek metaphor not work as well. But I want to share with you, in honor of the 500th anniversary of the first printing of the Jerusalem Talmud in Venice, a section of the Jerusalem Talmud. Up above in the upper corner, you can see the really only manuscript of the Jerusalem Talmud that exists. It's in Leiden. Down below, the first printed edition. To the right, the text that we're going to be dealing with. And I'm not going to call on anybody in the audience to read the Aramaic. We'll do English. So our story begins at a place called Caesarea Maritima on the coast of Palestine, the pagan capital of the Holy Land, all through the Roman period and the Byzantine period, a magnificent city, just down the hill from Samaria, where Jews and Samaritans together make up the majority, and Samaritans are more than Jews. Okay? An unusual situation. Here's the problem. Rabbi Abahu is a student of Rabbi Yochanan bar Nafcha, the leader of the rabbis in Tiberias, and an amazing person. He's on every page of the Talmud practically, as the centerpiece. When a study was done of names in the Talmud, there's a huge bump of rabbis exactly at the time of Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Abahu is his student who lived in Caesarea. Okay? Now, Rabbi Yochanan was involved in a process of centralizing the rabbinic community. In other words, he didn't like Amei Haaretz, peasants, very much, or he didn't like rich people who didn't listen to him very much. And he didn't like Christians very much, and he wasn't too fond of Samaritans either. In other words, he was centralizing the community as a power base as the rabbinic movement was on the rise in the 3rd century. Okay, so here we are in Tiberias, in Caesarea. Rabbi Abahu forbade their kuti wine according to the testimony of Rabbi Chia, Rabbi Asi, and Rabbi Ami. Okay, what's the problem with wine? We all know about kosher wine, right? Wine is a sacramental drink. In Judaism, it was always associated with paganism or with Judaism, and hence kosher wine. The question is Samaritan wine kosher? If Samaritan wine is kosher, then they are bona fide non-idolatrous Israelites. If it is not kosher, then they are not, and you can't drink their wine. There is economic problem involved in this if you're a Samaritan. Right? If you're a Samaritan, you can't sell your wine to the Jews, you lose money. If you're Jewish and you can't buy it, you may be spending more for your wine. None of them would buy wine from pagans. Okay? That's the deal. Okay. So these rabbis were going to Har HaMelech, going to the land that had been confiscated by the empire up across the top of the Judean hills. They were going through and they came up as far as Nablus, as Shechem. The mountain of the king, to the mountain of the king, and they saw a kuti who was suspect regarding their wine. He saw a Samaritan and he said, that Samaritan's drinking pagan wine. They came to Rabbi Abahu and told him this. And he said to him, well, if that Samaritan is drinking pagan wine, we don't let them drink our wine anymore. We don't drink their wine anymore. Okay? In other words, because of that one bad Samaritan, we're not going to drink Samaritan wine anymore. You know that when leaders choose one person as the example why they're going to do something, it's never that one person. It's a longer, bigger problem. And that is rabbis didn't have the power in Caesarea that they did in other places. Samaritans were up and coming minority. Okay? Let's keep going. There are some who say, though, that one Sabbath Eve, no wine was found in Samaria. And at the end of the Sabbath, it was found to be full of wine that the non-Jews had brought and that the Samaritans had accepted. Oh my God. Now, this may sound trivial, but it's not. Samaritans are drinking non-kosher wine. What do? Well, even worse. Diocletian came through in 286. And when Diocletian came through, all the peoples of the land had to do a libation to the emperor. That's standard Roman procedure, except for the Jews. Because since the time of Julius Caesar, Jews didn't have to do religious activities related to the cult of the emperor. It was a dispensation to those strange monotheists. Samaritans sometimes got that dispensation, sometimes didn't. By the 3rd century, rabbis are beginning to distance from Samaritans, and the dispensation is no longer in place. So Mr. Diocletian comes to town and says, okay, Samaritans, your turn. If they do not do the sacrifice, they are considered treasonous, hence killed. And so, again, Rabbi Abahu used the fact that some Samaritans went and did the civically necessary thing and sacrificed wine in order to preserve themselves as a way to push the Samaritans out of the polity. Or some say, they can't come up with a reason to get rid of these guys. Some say the following: they have a kind of dove and they pour out libations to it. Oh, well, this is Mount Gerizim. It hovers over Nablus. It hovers over Shechem. Sort of like as it was described, a nest over a city. So if you have a mountain that looks like a nest over a city, then you naturally associate it with birds. Hence, for example, the city of Tzipori in the Galilee is called Tzipori because it looks like a nest for birds, a tzipor. So here we have Mount Gerizim, and these folks are saying that at Mount Gerizim, they are sacrificing to a dove. Now, calling Samaritans dove worshippers is one of those awful things that Jews have done for the last 1,500 years. Were they dove worshippers? No. In fact, The only way you could think they're dove worshippers is from a coin like this one that comes from Nablus. And it shows on either side of just below it's an image of Mount Gerizim, two birds in cages. But the problem is the same coin was minted also in Damascus, and there's no Samaritans there. And so the coin has nothing to do with Samaritans, but if you want to taunt Samaritans, this is a good way to do it. Now, on the far left, the Christian mosaic from a floor that you can go see in Canberra. It was taken by the Australians back to Australia after World War I, from a place near the Gaza Strip. You notice it has a bird cage with a bird in it. In the middle, you see a bird cage with a bird in it as well, and a bowl with a bird as well. That's from a synagogue from the same region. But on the far side is a Samaritan synagogue floor, where they also put a bird cage, but no bird. They were very sensitive to this issue of people saying that they may be praying to birds. I remember when we had my son's bar mitzvah at the Chabad Center over in Amberley Village, and my wife and I decided we were going to paint the place. We painted the whole synagogue, and I got all these beautiful photographs of Chabad's life in New York and hung them up. And I said to Rabbi Commenson, "Where do you want the picture of the Rebbe?" I figured he put it in the front, right? And he looked at me and he said, "Put it in the back. I don't want anybody to think we're praying to it." Similarly, the birds. The Samaritans didn't put birds in their synagogue because someone would say that they were praying to it. Now, let's keep going. The Samaritans of Kesari couldn't figure out what's happening around them. This is real business. They're going to lose the sale of wine. And so they asked Rabbi Abahu, "Your fathers would use our wine. What's your problem?" And he looked at him and he said, "Your fathers did not corrupt their deeds. You have corrupted yours." I think more of the case is that the culture in which Rabbi Abahu lived had shifted, not that the Samaritans had changed. In other words, it's not that the Samaritans in this case had changed, it's that the rabbis had changed. In other words, their strictness towards Samaritans had developed that didn't exist in the past. You're looking at a Samaritan grape processing place, a got, in a place called Sur Natan, which is near Netanya. It was just excavated a couple of years ago, and there's a Samaritan synagogue right next to it. So Samaritans really were in the wine business in the area of Caesarea. And in case you're getting confused about the geography, Mount Gerizim is in the very center, well, right here. Sur Natan is over here, and Kesari is up in the corner. Okay, so this is the geography of what we're talking about, and I'm making it crazy with this camera. Now, you got the camera back? Cool. Okay. Now, Apollonia, our Shuf, which is near Herzliya, another Samaritan synagogue was found. So they were all over the place. They were a powerful group in the coastal plain in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries. But let me give you a completely different story, and this is one we're going to finish with. This is a story from a book called Vayikra Rabbah. Vayikra Rabbah is a wonderful collection of midrashim. It's by someone who clearly didn't like all the laws of Leviticus too much and really wanted to find something interesting to say about every single Torah portion, and created homilies to go with every single portion in this kind of medley of materials. And so in this case, there's a discussion, and it says, the Israelites are prominent because they know how to please their creator. And it does Samaritans, and it does Amei Haaretz, the ignorant people, and it does sharecroppers as a group, which is an interesting thing in and of itself. In other words, the Samaritans are included in the group. So here's the story. The Israelites are prominent because they want to appease their creator. Rabbi Yudin said, like the Kutai, like those Samaritan people. Why? Because the Kutai are clever in business. Because those Samaritans, well, they're good at business. It's what they said about Jews, right? So we have a Samaritan going house to house, as you're going to see, doing business. One of them went to a woman. Down below, you see the Talmudic village of Katsarim, which is in the Golan Heights. I show it both to give you a sense of what a kitchen could look like and a building could look like. And frankly, because I was part of the team that reconstructed and interpreted the Talmudic house in Kasserine, so I'm partial to it. And so here you see a village. Imagine a Samaritan passing through it. Rabbi Yudin said, like those Kutai, they're very clever. They're clever in business. One of them went to a woman. He said to her, walks up to her door, goes up to the kitchen and says, do you have an onion? Give it to me. Okay. When she brought it to him, he said to her, what's an onion without bread? So she gave him bread. When she brought it to him, he said to her, what's a meal without a drink? Right? And she came out and gave him something to drink, and he ate and drank. Now, what you see in this story is a trickster tale. The Samaritan is trickster. Usually in these stories that we hear is the Jews as the tricksters who are, on the carts going around America and up in Cincinnati, Ohio, create lies for themselves. But in this case, it's the Samaritan is the trickster in a Jewish village. He's the traitor. He's the outsider insider. And that outsider insider knocks on the door and he's hungry and he's fed. So we saw a good Samaritan at the beginning. Right? At the end, we see a very nice Jewish lady. We see communities in conversation with each other. We see communities sometimes in a death dance with each other. But through the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, things were very different. But before I end, let me point out that Jews and Samaritans have been together for a long, long time. In medieval Cairo, they lived in the same community and they were under the same jurisdiction. There's even a text from the Cairo Geniza that describes a fellow Samaritan going to a Jewish court and asking for support. So there were relationships all the way through. I found a wonderful story in an early modern book that describes, he said, oh, I saw this Samaritan story and I thought it was so good that I put it at the back of my midrash. Before you knew it, it had been copied in Jewish literature across the system, but everyone forgot that it was a Samaritan book, including Louis Ginsburg and Legends of the Jews. In other words, a Samaritan story found its way into Jewish stories, just as Jewish stories find their way into Samaritan stories. In the 19th century, Jews rediscovered Samaritans. Why? Because in 1842, as you saw in my movie, there was a good chance that they were going to be wiped out by the locals in Nablus. And the Turks were all for it, because after all, these people, are they dhimmi? Do they get second-class citizenship or don't they? But for being people of the book. And the question was, are they? They went to the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. That's what they were looking for in that library, to find a letter that the chief rabbi, a fellow named Yaakov Gagin, wrote that said, the Samaritans are Israelites who believe in the Torah of Moses. That moment saved them from extinction. They would have been killed otherwise. And it was the beginning of a change in a relationship. You can watch it over a 70-year period until finally 2 people came on the scene who, for the first time in the history of the Samaritans, wanted nothing from them except to be friends. You know that scene in the Frisco Kid where he gets up and sees the Amish people and yells out Landsman and chases them, right? This is that kind of relationship. He looked out and they saw relatives. They didn't see people to exploit or people to convert. And so Moses Gaster, by the way, in whose living room the Balfour Declaration was written, he had a typewriter where he'd write back and forth with the high priest, and they'd have conversations and they'd ask each other questions, and Gaster would find funding for the community. Colonialism does have its advantages for some minorities. Similarly, when Yitzchak ben Tzvi, a young Zionist, shows up in Palestine, he finds a house in Jaffa with a Samaritan guy, makes friends with him, and becomes a benefactor for the community. To this day, the Samaritans are under the personal attention of the president of Israel. So much so that we have a stone in our exhibition that was brought from the garden of the president, a Samaritan 11th century inscription, to our exhibition. And at the opening, we had a video from President Herzog saying how thrilled he was that this stone that his predecessor had collected had come to the Samaritan exhibition in America. The Samaritans and the Jews have found a way to live together. Now, I've been saying this for a while now, and it's beginning to come out. I said it most clearly on the Tel Aviv Review recently in a conversation. The Samaritans are a good place to talk about getting along, about dealing with people that we may not necessarily agree with, or that we can only agree 95% with and not 100. And they're a safe place because, after all, Samaritans could fill up exactly 2 747s. That's all there are. You can't be too scared of people who can fill up 2 747s. They're a great place to deal with what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be Christian, what it means to be an Israelite, what it means to be an Israeli, what it means to be a Palestinian, all in some amazing mix. Now, our film had such incredible access. Can you imagine people being willing to talk to us about menstruation? Can you imagine that those women were willing to do it? Can you imagine the Chazan, Najah, being willing to talk to Brito the way he did? By the way, Brito is not yet married. Natasha and Shoddy are trying, and Abud is married, in case anybody wants to know. So things are moving. If you come to our exhibition, you'll see that there is not a Samaritan on the wall who doesn't have a name. If you look at our book, you'll see there's not a Samaritan in the book who is not a person and doesn't have a name. We worked really, really hard to get names of people who've been dead for 150 years sometimes, because I was committed that if we're going to create this event, there's going to be an event that Samaritans could be proud of and that we could too. And so our film is the expose, I don't know, the 5-year deep dive of my friend Moshe Alafi that let you into a place where you'd never get otherwise. Would you remember the scene where he goes in with the Abisha scroll? I remember I said, Moshe, go get the Abisha scroll. And they kept saying, you can't see the Abisha scroll. No one gets to see the Abisha scroll. You don't get to see the Abisha scroll. And one day in the middle of COVID, I get an email from Moshe. They're letting me in to see the Abisha scroll. What do I photograph? Right? And so the two of us sat on WhatsApp talking through how he was going to film. And it was that way with almost every scene. But the most brilliant one was that he called me up and said, you know, I think I'm going to build it around the women. That's never been done. You know how hard it was for that book to get pictures of women? There are 50 different pictures of every high priest, every guy killing a sheep you can imagine. Getting pictures of women was not easy. For every 100 pictures of men, there was one picture of a woman. It was not an easy thing, but we managed to come to pretty much parity in the book. Because I kept looking and looking and looking. Now, why? Because it's telling the story in a way that gives us access and feeling. Now, let me say something about Khorasan. It doesn't exist anymore, really, right? All those people who stayed there are refugees. There are so many people, so many kids in our day schools in New York City who are Asian because their fathers married women from China 20 years ago. It's the same kind of thing, people meeting online. In this case, it's 1, then 2, then 3. When I first started showing the film, people thought it was so unwholesome that they found people outside the community. The reality is, Shoddy is the ultimate everyman. There's nothing special about Shoddy except he's cute as a button, right? But there's nothing. Did you hear his word for pigs? Khul khul, right? And his word for cow, for beef, mumu. Right? Shoddy is the ultimate simple guy. He works for DHL at the airport. That's why he's Hebrew. So does Brito. So does Abud. They take the same car together to the airport every day, and they work for DHL doing shipping. Right? They're nice, good people, and Natasha is nice, good people. And if we had beautiful people, if we'd had the Samaritan, the Ukrainian woman who speaks Arabic and Hebrew so well, you would say, oh, another beautiful couple, right? Shoddy and Natasha could be you and me. And that's what we wanted. We wanted you and me. We wanted to get access to real life human beings and what it means to be a real life human being, because it's easy for me to do one of those meet the natives or like these wonderful pictures on the walls, right? They're all icons. But I can tell you, there's Najah and there's Kohen Chad there, and these are people, and there's Najah over here. You know, you hear my point. These are all people. And I can tell you, Najah's wife worked in Bank of Poalim, and the reason she only takes her picture from this side, you couldn't tell, but she only does it from this side, is that this side was attacked with acid during the first Intifada. She doesn't want to put it in pictures. You know, people, and for me, that's number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 10. Whether it's people in the world who are called Rabbi Elazar, or whether it's people in the world who are called Najah. In my work and what I do for a living, it's always about human beings. It's never, books are those things where human beings live. They're not the subject, they're the tool. Archaeology is the stuff that people made, not the subject, but the tool. Because the job for me is to project Rabbi Akiva into 3D. Yes, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? With Princess Leia with Obi-Wan Kenobi. Project into the field what I can imagine people in the 3rd century looked like. In order to do that, I have to understand about people in the 21st century, because if I don't, then I have no tools with which to start imagining. And so our film, and so our exhibition, and so our book, so our cookbook, which is like every other Near Eastern cookbook, except it's ours, and it has Samaritan pictures in it. So I'm open for whatever anybody would like to discuss. Please.
So I'm a cantor.
Cool.
Can you please, we're getting extra.
As a result,
I'll repeat your question.
As a result, the thing that caught my fancy was the notion that
Brito,
is
from the word Brit.
right. No, but he's the only one who has inherited the nusach. You know,
It's not true. It's overstated. Just like there are now people because of this that are learning how to write scrolls.
okay,
In other words, they've realized the crisis.
but will they record it so that it can be transcribed?
I got to tell you. Yes, recording of traditions. The first traditions were recorded by Moses Gaster in 1900 on wax cylinders that are at a university in England, and we haven't quite yet managed to get them open yet. But it's now that COVID's over, I'm going to bug them again and see, can we try again and get the British Library to do it for us? There was a woman named Joanna Spector who taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Oh, you've heard of her. Joanna Spector was amazing. Her archive is at the seminary, and she dealt with everybody that no one else dealt with. She dealt with Yemenites, she dealt with Indians, and of course she dealt with Samaritans. And she was there right after the 6-Day War when everything was really fresh. Now, as far as their reading traditions, Zev Ben Chaim, who was a great scholar at the Hebrew University of Hebrew language, dedicated his life to their reading traditions. And so we have oodles of tape. They are the most studied group for that piece of who they are. Now, as far as history, culture, at this point, they often come to me in America, or to, more to the point, to Reinhardt Boomer in Ottawa, but there aren't very many. And in fact, our book is dedicated to Benny Tzedakah, who you met, and to Reinhardt Boomer, who's amazing, mainly because for the last 2 decades, anytime I've had a question, I would call up, hello, Reinhardt, what do I do now? And he would tell me with open hands, because this is one thing that that small group of Samaritan scholars is kind and wanting to let people in. But try getting a job in American University doing Samaritans. It's not what they want to hear. So you better get a Jewish studies job. It's just like you can't get a job in Jewish art in America. You better be Jewish history. In other words, there's a narrowing of what it means to be Jewish outside of the Jewish institutions. And so this is my advertisement for the Hebrew Union College, right? There's a narrowing of what it means to be Jewish in the bigger world that our Jewish institutions are the precious repositories of, whether it be my Yeshiva University or whether it be Hebrew Union College or Jewish Theological Seminary or our other sisters at Brandeis and other places. Yes.
Why not look to Israel for wives? Why go outside of Israel?
Well, the people who, yes, why did they marry foreigners? It's bad enough to marry Jews, but why are they marrying Gentiles? No, it's a much worse question. It's a much harder question I just asked. Look, the ones from Cologne which is half the community, they're Israelis in every way. They find Jewish girls to marry, and they get married, and the Sephardi parents aren't usually happy, and the Samaritan parents aren't always so happy, but everybody makes it work. Okay, and that works, and they're much more Israelicized than the ones on Mount Gerizim. You could hear their Hebrew still has a lot of Arabic behind it. After the 6-Day War, Beni Tzedakah worked it out that the leaders of the community all went to Ulpan to learn Hebrew. They didn't know Hebrew. Najah went to Ulpan to learn Hebrew, which is an amazing thing. Now, what nice Jewish girl is going to go live on Mount Gerizim? Is going to go live in Shechem, right? It's just not going to happen. And so they tried finding Israeli girls, and it didn't work. The bigger problem was when they couldn't find Israeli girls, they'd never had Gentiles before. It's a big deal. They don't have a procedure for conversion. The procedure for converting Jewish girls was, do they let you eat the Passover sacrifice? That has been transferred through the winking and basic acquiescence of the high priest to the Ukrainian woman. But you heard Najah told the truth. There's all sorts of stuff going on that they never had before. What's going to be for the next generation when 50 of the mothers are from the Ukraine? Some of them are like Ella are going to be, full Samaritans. Others are going to be different. And even if they do become full Samaritans, they don't have the full tradition of talking about, their Samaritan bubby that transfers from generation to generation. And what are the implications for community? Now, the thing about our movie is that it was done by Yeshiva University, which, as you know, is the largest Jewish institution in the United States outside of the state of Israel. And it's an Orthodox institution. We're not the ones anyone would expect to do Samaritans. It's done by Moshe Alafi, who's an Orthodox guy in Israel. We did a Jewish movie. In other words, we asked the questions that we would ask, which turned out to be the questions that they wanted to answer. We didn't ask the Christian questions. We didn't ask about theology. We didn't ask about Palestinians. We didn't ask about all those things that are important to people who come from a different family. We asked the inside the family questions. How are you going to survive? How are you going to deal with these women? How are you different on Passover? Right? We asked the inside questions. And it came off as an inside question. Now, watching you guys watch the film was the most interesting thing, because we showed it at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale on Saturday night, and they were laughing from the third line. It took about until Elah started and said, kind of like Jews, that people realized there was humor there. And then I started hearing the roars coming through the audience. But in a far more Jewishly educated world, which is a modern Orthodox synagogue in New York City, they were catching that this was their story immediately, in a way that it took here another 12 minutes, which is pretty good, right? Because it's all the same family story. But they were catching the hint because the Samaritans are observant, like the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale people are observant. The Samaritans follow the laws of Nida, of menstruation. The Jews have their own laws of menstruation, right? There's things that you can feel if you live within those two traditional communities that have never been exposed outward with this level of intensity. And that's what the film is about. I'm glad it came through. Please.
What happened with the people in Brazil?
Can
you repeat that?
Yes, what happened with the people in Brazil? There are a few there. These are sort of like people who walked through Christianity, a few different kinds, usually former Catholics, tried Judaism for a little bit, picked up Samaritans a little bit. There are a few people out there. When Haaretz went looking to actually meet a whole bunch of them, they didn't find them. I'll just leave it at that. Okay, so what do I say? I'm hoping someone in South America is listening who can prove me wrong. Please. I'm glad.
Insulted. Isn't that a Talmudic or Midrashic understanding that they came from some other place, they were relocated to the Holy Land, and they held themselves out as Jews, and the rabbis resented them for that. I remember hearing that as a potential.
What's even more complex? Yes. What about the Kutim thing, right? It comes from the second book of Kings. Some people will remember this group of people is brought from this place called Kuta, which is somewhere out there in Babylonia, in Assyria. And they settle in and they start doing their idolatry thing. And then God sends lions and they decide, oh, this idolatry thing is a bad idea. And they convert into Israelite religion and they're suspect forevermore. Right? I got it right? I think so. Now, the question is, if you ask the Samaritans, they'll tell you, yeah, they went to Kuta. They were forced there the same way the Jews were forced to go to Babylonia. Leave me alone. That's how the Samaritans responded to that taunt, right? But it's an internal biblical taunt that's continued into Second Temple, because Josephus talks about it, and then continues into rabbis, and continues to this day. If you read the Encyclopedia Talmudit upstairs, they have an article they did an edition of this rabbinic text called Masechet Kutim, and the guy who did the article clearly didn't like Samaritans and calls them Kutim all the way through. My kid would have been really unhappy. And more to the point, Samaritan kids don't deserve it. I mean, when you have to look someone in the eye who you disliked for 3,500 years, can you continue? That's the question, right? And what I've forced you to do with the movie is look him in the eye. Can you really call Brito some awful name? He's a person now. It's not those Kutim who destroyed the temple. It's Brito's ancestors who I'm angry at, but what did he do? Right? It's sort. I always tell Jewish groups, you know, Christians spent 2,000 years killing us for killing a certain person. Right? Deicide. I didn't do it, you didn't do it, but the claim went on that if you don't convert, you continue to do the sin and hence you're continuing to kill him, right? We did something similar, but not really similar because it's not killing anybody, with Samaritans, right? We wouldn't let it go. Christians have worked very hard to let it go in the years since the Shoah, particularly Catholics and some kinds of Protestants, right? They've worked very hard to do some kind of repentance, and it's amazing how much has been done. It's a good model, I think, for dealing with a group that we've been related to for 3,500 years. And even if you never meet them, it provides a comparison point. And our film provides for that comparison point. And that's, if you're asking my larger moral reason for doing it, that's the one. Yes, yes, ma'am. What's the motivation of the women from the Ukraine to come? For this, it's the same motivation that women from China in the 1980s came and married guys in San Diego. All right, for a better life. Period. You know how awful life can be in those countries. Now the Samaritan guys are nice guys mostly, right? And they have nice houses, and it's an odd life, but they're choosing it. And you can see how much by the time Betty is bothering Natasha about getting pregnant at the end, you can see that she's her own person, and she and Shoddy are a team. Right? In other words, things that start out in ways that, you know, don't come off J-Date sometimes work. And that's the deal. And one brings the next, it brings the next, it brings the next. That's why there's a lot of German Jews in Cincinnati, Ohio, right? Because one brings the next. Or where? Just now, just before the war, just before COVID. We finished it during COVID. It was open. It opened in Jerusalem, Hanukkah. It opened in New York just before. We finished during the war, and we were cognizant that Corson wasn't there by the time we produced it. No, it was before the war. It was all before the war. But if that was a reason today to come, I could understand it completely. One more question, please. Yes, ma'am.
This was fascinating. I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about the Samaritan Diaspora, both either during the Roman period or potentially today. That is, how are community connections maintained? Was there a system if somebody couldn't get to Mount Gerizim or Passover, for example? Yeah.
And we're going home when? Okay, so let me give you the shorthand. I'll give you the short answer, okay? There was a Samaritan Diaspora in antiquity and it was big. There were Samaritans on Delos. We have Samaritan Stones. I didn't show the slide. There's Samaritan Stones from Syracuse in Sicily. There's a Samaritan Stone from Thessalonica. We have lots of literature. They were in Rome. Church fathers talk about it. In other words, we have a lot of Samaritans all over the Mediterranean basin, okay? In the 19th century, I'm skipping. There were Samaritans in Tulkarm and in Gaza and in Jaffa. In the 18th century, there were Samaritans in Damascus, but they were wiped out. And so that whatever was left came to Mount Gerizim. In the 16th century, there were Samaritans in Cairo. In other words, it's not the case that they never left. That's the rhetoric, right? But they always had this centeredness. Now, what did it mean for Jews who couldn't come for the Passover sacrifice for all those years, right? I mean, I do this thing, and this is a good place to end. I once went with my YU students to a place called Nazareth Village, which is a sort of Jesus village in Nazareth. And it's beautifully reconstructed, and you know, Mary comes to the door and offers you olives, and Joseph does stone carving or wood carving, and there's a version of it at the Museum of the Bible, but it's plastic. And you go into this thing at the Nazareth Village, and I'm with my students who were walking through, and it was just before Tisha B'Av, just before the 9th of Av, the destruction of the temples. And I said, okay, guys, you're in Nazareth Village, and it's the 10th of Av, and you get the word that Jerusalem's been destroyed by Titus. So what do you do tomorrow? What did the Samaritans do in 110 BCE, right? What do you do when you live in diaspora? What if you do when you're in diaspora, when you're in the place you actually live? These are the complexities of being a historical religion, and particularly this group of Israelite religions. And the astonishing thing is what both groups decided was to quote the Torah, where it says, you know, v'chai b'hem, and you live by the commandments, and as the rabbis added, v'lo lamut b'hem, and not die by them. So with that, please come back tomorrow. We're talking about Samaritan Tabernacle. That will be really fun. And I think they're serving lunch, right?
Yes.
And they're serving lunch, and it will be kosher. So everybody should come. And in the meantime, drive safely. Thanks.
Thank